He's too weak to fight us. That's what they said. My own nephews, voices sharp with youth, laughter too careless for the weight of their words. I sat in the corner of the dining room that day, a quiet figure in a chair that had grown too small for me over the years. The oak table, scarred with knife marks from generations of meals, carried stacks of papers I wasn't meant to see. They didn't even bother to hide them: deeds, agreements, and a pen rolling between their fingers. My land, our family's land. The room smelled faintly of coffee grounds, and damp earth tracked in on boots. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains, throwing patterns on the wood floor where my shadow stretched thin and still. I let them talk. I let them laugh. My silence was the cloak I had worn all my life, and they mistook it for weakness. Old Ed won't know the difference, one of them said, flipping through papers as if they were playing cards. He can't fight us. He doesn't have it in him. Quote, their words didn't sting the way they expected. I had felt sharper cuts in my time, the kind you don't see, the kind that comes from watching those you raised turn their back. But this was a different wound. Not just betrayal. It was erasure. I shifted in my chair. The wood groaned softly, but they didn't look up. My hands, rough and veined from decades of fencing and soil, rested flat on my knees. I thought about how those same hands once held theirs when they were boys, guiding them through fields, teaching them the lay of the land. Now those hands were invisible to them. The smell of ink drifted faintly, sharp and metallic. The papers slid across the table with a whisper. I could almost hear the weight of generations sliding with them. My father's voice came back to me, deep and steady. Land is the only thing that doesn't betray you, Edward. Treat it well, and it will outlast them all. I did treat it well. I walked those fields when snow buried them to my waist. I paid taxes when others were late. I mended fences while my back burned under the sun. I carried the land like a second skin. And now, at the end of my years, they tried to peel it from me with a pin. I did not protest. Not yet. Instead, I let the sound of their laughter hang in the room like a bell that would not stop ringing. I studied their faces, one with a smirk too wide, another with eyes darting nervously. They were bold, but not wise. And boldness without wisdom always leaves cracks. As the pen scratched across the page, I imagined the soil outside. Still damp from morning dew, still mine in ways they could never touch. The land remembers. It holds the footprints of every man who walked it. The sweat that fell, the blood that marked it. Paper can trick people for a time, but not the earth itself. I leaned back and closed my eyes briefly. I saw the fields in winter, endless white, silence broken only by crows. I saw the spring thaw, mud thick around boots, seedlings pressing through frost. I saw summer heat that bent even the strongest men, and autumn gold that softened the hardest days. That land lived with me. They thought they could sever it, but they were only cutting their own roots. Their voices faded into the hum of the clock on the wall. Tick, tick. Each sound measured patience. Mine was deep. Theirs was shallow. When they finally looked my way, one of them raised an eyebrow. Uncle, you still here? Don't worry. We'll take care of things. You just rest. Rest. That was their word for burying me alive. I stood slowly, joints stiff but steady. The chair scraped against the floor. I didn't answer them. Words at that moment would have been wasted. Instead, I walked past the table, past the papers that pretended to hold truth, past the boys who thought they had become men. The screen door creaked as I stepped out. Cool air brushed my face, carrying the smell of damp hay and distant rain. I paused on the porch, hand resting on the railing worn smooth by decades of palms. My eyes swept across the fields. Still mine. Always mine, even if the ink tried to say otherwise. Behind me, their laughter started again. But the land was quiet. And in that quiet, I found the only answer I needed. Patience. They had played their first card. I would play the last. And I knew already it would be enough. The fields stretched before me as I stepped off the porch, boots sinking into soil that had known my weight for decades. The air was damp, carrying the smell of rain and manure from the barns. Clouds rolled low across the horizon, dark and heavy, promising storms. I walked the ridgeline slowly, letting each step sink into the ground like a promise. The land had always been my confidant, my witness. Every fence post I drove, every stone I moved, every furrow I cut into its back had been done with the certainty that it belonged to me and I belonged to it. That bond doesn't vanish with ink. I stopped at the edge of the northern field, where the oak tree stood crooked against the wind. My father had planted it the year I was born. I remember his calloused hands covering mine, as I pressed dirt around the sapling. "This tree will watch over you longer than I can," he said. His voice still lived in its bark. Now I touched its trunk, fingers sliding over grooves carved by time. The betrayal of my kin burned fresh inside me, but it was no wildfire. It was a slow ember, glowing steady, ready to spread when the wind turned. I remembered another time betrayal brushed close. Years ago, a neighbor tried to claim half an acre by moving the boundary stones. I said nothing for weeks, watching, noting every misplaced rock. Then one morning I walked to the county office with my maps, the very ones I had drawn with my own hands. The neighbor's claim collapsed before it even began. He never spoke to me again, but he never touched my land either. That memory lingered as I stood there, watching crows scatter across the gray sky. The boys thought they were clever, thought I was too feeble to act, but I had walked this path before, quietly, patiently, always ending the same way, with truth standing firm. Back at the house, I saw them through the window. Paper stacked high, coffee mugs half empty. They leaned over the table, heads bent, plotting their future. My future, they thought. I watched their mouths move, their hands gesturing with false confidence. It wasn't anger that filled me, it was clarity. Anger burns too fast. Clarity lasts. I turned toward the barn. Its doors sagged, hinges rusted but holding. Inside, the smell of hay and oil clung thick. I ran my hand along the tractor I had rebuilt twice over, each part replaced with patience and care. They never understood that kind of work, the slow dedication, the refusal to let something die before its time. The same way I refused to let myself be written off. I sat on the old workbench, dust motes rising in the light that streamed through the cracks. My hand found the ledger I kept, leather worn, pages yellowed with years. Inside were lines of figures, dates, tax receipts, every payment I had made to keep the land afloat. My signature at the bottom of each one. My handwriting, steady as the seasons. I ran my thumb across the ink, felt the grooves pressed into paper by the weight of my pen. Proof doesn't just live in courts. It lives in the habits of a man who refuses to let go. Their words echoed again in my mind. He's too weak to fight us. Weakness they thought was silence. Weakness they thought was old age. Weakness they thought was a bowed back and slow step. But silence isn't weakness. Silence is preparation. Age isn't weakness. Age is patience sharpened into a blade. I closed the ledger and set it aside. The storm outside broke then, rain hammering against the tin roof, rattling like 1,000 small fists. The sound filled the barn, drowning out every memory of laughter, every insult, every careless dismissal. I let the storm speak for me. That night, when I lay in bed, I heard them still in the kitchen, voices muffled through walls. They spoke of dividing parcels, of renting out fields, of what they would build and what they would sell, their futures stacked neatly on the foundation of my labor. I closed my eyes. The mattress sagged beneath my weight, springs creaking in protest. The smell of rain lingered, seeping through open windows. I thought of my father's will, locked away in a drawer. I thought of the old maps with my name at the bottom corner. I thought of every tax slip folded and filed in my ledger. Pieces of a puzzle they didn't even know existed. The house settled around me with groans of wood. Outside, frogs croaked low, answering the storm. My breathing slowed. Not the restless breathing of a man defeated, but the steady rhythm of one already planning. They thought I was asleep. They thought I was finished. But patience is the one thing they never learned from me. And patience is the one thing that wins. The morning light came pale and thin through the curtains, touching the room with that soft gray that comes just before the sun decides to commit to the day. I sat up slowly, my joints stiff, my breath steady. The old quilt on my bed smelled faintly of cedar and years. I swung my feet to the floor, felt the cool wood under my soles, and listened to the quiet. A man grows to treasure silence after a life of noise. Cattle, storms, tractors, voices I had lived through them all. Silence, when it finally arrives, feels like a reward. But as I stood and looked out the window toward the fields, silence became something else. Memory. I saw myself younger, shoulders broad, hands stronger, rising before dawn to milk cows in the dim light of kerosene lamps. The barn steamed in winter, warm breath of animals clouding the air. In summer, sweat stung my eyes before breakfast. And always, the land called me. There were seasons when the harvest failed, when blight blackened the corn and storms flattened the wheat. Neighbors sold out, moved away, left empty houses to rot. But I stayed. I stayed because my father had stayed, and his father before him. And when the bills came due, when taxes piled higher than the hay bales, I paid them. Sometimes with cash earned surveying land for others. Sometimes with loans I carried alone so the family wouldn't bear the shame. I remember one winter clearer than most. Snow had fallen heavy, burying fences, collapsing barns. My brother had broken his leg and could barely walk. My nephews were still boys, too young to pull their weight. I strapped on boots, pulled a scarf over my face, and worked until my lungs burned from cold. I shoveled paths, hauled wood, patched roofs with numb hands. For months, I was the only thing standing between that farm and ruin. No one remembers that now, but I do. I walked to the dresser and pulled out a folded letter. The paper had yellowed, the ink fading, but the words were carved into me like scripture. It was from my father, written before he died, thanking me for holding the family together. He wrote, "Edward, you are the anchor. Without you, we drift." I had been the anchor, always the one to stay, to hold fast, to bend but never break. And yet, anchors sink, don't they? They rest beneath the surface, unseen, while others sail freely above, never noticing the weight that steadies them. That was my role. I accepted it. But now those who sailed because I held them steady had cut the chain, left me to rust in the dark. I dressed slowly, heavy wool pants, suspenders, the same boots I had worn for years. My body ached with the dull throb of old injuries, a back strained from lifting too much, knees swollen from endless walking across uneven fields. I carried every season in my bones. Outside, the morning air was damp with dew. I walked the path to the barn, gravel crunching underfoot. The smell of hay greeted me, mingled with oil and the faint sourness of manure. I paused at the threshold, let the memories flood me again. I saw my younger self leaning against this doorway, watching as my nephews chased each other through the yard, their laughter bright and clean. I had smiled then, proud to think they would one day inherit not just the land, but the lessons. I was wrong. Inside, I picked up an old rake, the handle polished smooth by years of calloused palm. My father's hands had worn it first, then mine. Tools remember their owners. The wood carries the shape of fingers long gone. This rake was proof of work, of sacrifice, of a line unbroken. I dragged it slowly across the floor, hay rustling in low whispers. My mind wandered again to the long nights I spent fixing broken machinery while the others slept, to the mornings when I rode out alone to bring back strays from the far hills, to the afternoons when I signed checks with trembling hands, knowing my own pockets would never be full again. And yet I had never complained. Not once. I thought sacrifice would buy loyalty. I thought patience would earn respect. I thought blood would protect blood. But the truth is, sacrifice is invisible to those who benefit from it. They only see the comfort, not the cost. I stepped back out into the yard. The sun had finally broken through, washing the fields in pale gold. The soil glistened, heavy with dew, alive and rich. I breathed deep, the air thick with earth and promise. This was what I had worked for. This was what I had held together. Every blade of grass, every furrow, every fence, post my sweat bound them. My years paid for them. My sacrifices held them. And yet, at a table inside the house, they erased me with a laugh. I stood there, letting the morning wash over me, letting the memories sit heavy but steady. Because memory, unlike land deeds, cannot be stolen. And I knew then, if patience had been my strength in sacrifice, it would be my strength in revenge. The sun climbed higher as I moved across the yard, its warmth brushing against my face. Each step carried me deeper into memory. Sacrifice is not something you remember in pieces, it comes back whole, like a tide, reminding you of everything you gave and everything you lost. I walked toward the southern field, where the soil turns darker after rain. That patch had nearly broken me once. I remembered the year when the corn failed. Drought left the ground cracked, the stalks brittle as straw. My brother wanted to abandon it, sell off the land, but I refused. I carried buckets of water, morning after morning, my back bent, sweat soaking my shirt, until at last some stalks pushed through. We harvested half what we needed, but it was enough to survive. It was always me who refused to quit. I paused, leaning against the old fence. The wood was warped, its nails rusted, but it still held together. Like me, my hands brushed across the grain, and I felt scars not only in the wood, but in myself. Rope burns from years of pulling, calluses from endless work, lines carved deep in my skin like maps of sacrifice. I could still hear my mother's voice, soft but steady, urging me on during those lean years. Edward, don't let the land go. It remembers who tends it. She was right. The land does remember. It held my sweat in its soil, my breath in its fields, my footsteps in its furrows. But blood doesn't always remember. Family forgets. I walked further, toward the riverbank. The smell of wet earth rose up, sharp and alive. I thought of the countless nights I stayed up late with lamplight flickering, counting coins to see if we could pay taxes. My hands shook with exhaustion, but I never let them see it. When my brother's family needed medicine, I found the money. When they wanted new plows, I made sure they had them. I was always the one to give, always the one to bend so they didn't break. I told myself it was worth it, that one day they would see, that one day they would know. But sacrifice, once made, is invisible. They took the harvest, but never remembered the seed. As I stood at the river's edge, the water moved slow and sure, carrying silt and memory downstream. I thought of the floods that nearly swallowed us once, when water filled the lower fields and drowned half the crop. I worked day and night stacking sandbags, dragging machinery to higher ground. My hands blistered raw, my back twisted with pain. But we survived. They slept while I worked. They dreamed while I bled. And now they called me weak. I bent down, picked up a stone smooth from the river's current. Its weight sat heavy in my palm. I turned it over, studying its surface. A stone endures pressure, water, time, and still holds its shape. That's what I had become. Worn, weathered, but unbroken. The wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney. It reminded me of evenings long ago, when I sat on the porch after a day's work, listening to my nephews chatter about the future. They wanted land, cattle, houses. They wanted everything, and I had thought giving would teach them gratitude. Instead, giving had only taught them greed. I tossed the stone back into the river, watched ripples spread across the surface. They would fade soon enough, as all ripples do. But the river remained, strong, unmoved, just as I would. The sun was higher now, warming my shoulders. I turned back toward the house, toward the voices that had once belonged to boys I taught to fish, to mend, to endure. They had forgotten, but I had not. Sacrifice had been my life's language, and though they could not hear it, I still spoke it fluently. But from this day forward, sacrifice would no longer be my gift. It would be my weapon. I walked slowly, my shadow long behind me, cast across the fields I had saved, more times than they could count. Each step I took felt like a quiet vow, a steady reminder that the past was not weakness. It was preparation. And when the time came, every sacrifice I had made would become the very proof of their downfall. The courthouse smelled of dust and paper. Old wood benches lined the hall, their varnish dulled by decades of weary hands and restless feet. My nephew's laugh, sharp and careless, bouncing off the marble walls as he walked out of the clerk's office with a stack of documents under his arm. He didn't see me in the shadowed corner, didn't notice the way my eyes followed him. He handed the papers to his brother, who scanned them with a grin too wide for his face. "Done," he said. "All clean. Uncle won't even know what hit him." The words dropped like stones into water, sending ripples through me. Not anger clarity, not fire ice. I sat there alone, hat in my lap, watching sunlight cut through tall windows and fall in narrow beams across the floor. It wasn't the first time I had been inside that building. I had signed tax slips there, registered livestock, renewed deeds. But this time was different. This time, I wasn't there to maintain what was mine. I was there to discover how it had been stolen. My name wasn't on the papers anymore. I heard it before I saw it. I simply let my gaze drop to the papers he was trying so hard to conceal. He followed my eyes, fingers tightening around the stack. For a moment, the hallway was filled only with the ticking of the courthouse clock above us. Each second stretched long, deliberate, like a reminder that time reveals everything. Finally, I spoke. My voice was low, steady. "You've taken my name off the deed." Neither of them answered. Their silence confirmed what I already knew. I stepped closer, slow enough that the sound of my boots echoed against the floor. My hand brushed the brim of my hat, steady as stone. "After everything I've done," I said, not raising my voice, not needing to. "After everything I carried." The younger one tried to laugh, but it came out brittle. "It's just business, Uncle. You're old. You don't need all that land anymore. We'll take care of it. We'll take care of you. Take care of me, as if I were a child, as if decades of work, sacrifice, and sweat could be folded into pity." I stood in front of them now, close enough to see the ink stains on their fingers, the smugness cracking under my stare. "You think paper changes the soil?" I asked quietly. They didn't answer. I let the silence stretch, let them feel the weight of it. Then I stepped aside, walked past them toward the clerk's office. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the smell of ink and old parchment wrapping around me. The clerk looked up from behind the counter, spectacles sliding down his nose. "Edward," he said softly, almost apologetic. I thought you knew." He slid a file across the desk. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. Page after page, signed and stamped, bore no trace of my name. Where once Edward Halbrook had been inked in steady lines, now only theirs remained. My blood erased with strokes of a pen. The room tilted slightly, not with shock, but with the weight of realization. Betrayal isn't a blow. It's a slow knife. You don't feel it until it's deep. I closed the file carefully, my fingers lingering on its edge. I looked at the clerk, who shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet my eyes. "They said you agreed to it," he whispered. My jaw tightened. Did they now? I turned, file still in my hand, and walked past my nephews without a word. Their smirks had faltered, replaced by the faint edge of unease. They watched me go, perhaps expecting an outburst, perhaps hoping for it. But I gave them nothing. Outside, the air was sharp with the smell of rain. Clouds gathered thick over the town square, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps. I stood there for a long moment, letting the weight of it settle. My name was gone from the papers, but not from the land. Paper burns, ink fades, but the earth remembers. I folded the file under my arm and walked down the steps, each movement steady, deliberate. The betrayal was complete, but so was my resolve. They had stolen with laughter. I would reclaim in silence. The news spread faster than rain across dry soil. By the end of the week, everyone in town seemed to know. At the feed store, I felt eyes linger on me longer than usual. Conversations hushed when I walked in. At the diner, where I had eaten breakfast nearly every Sunday for 40 years, the waitress filled my coffee cup with a smile too soft, too careful. Pity hung in the air, heavier than the smell of fried bacon. They all knew. My nephews had made sure of it. "They said you gave it up," an old neighbor muttered once, standing beside me at the seed bins. His voice carried hesitation, as if testing whether the story was true. "Said you couldn't manage anymore." I didn't answer him. I just scooped seed into my sack, the grains rattling like small stones, and walked out into the sunlight. My silence confirmed nothing, but it left space for doubt. That doubt was enough for now. Back home, I found them already in the fields. My nephews, driving machinery I had repaired a dozen times, walking rows I had sown and harvested for decades. Their laughter carried across the land like a crow's caw, harsh and out of place. One of them waved at me, grinning wide. "Uncle, you should rest. We've got it handled now." Handled. That word stuck like grit in my teeth. I stood at the fence line watching as they worked without rhythm, without understanding the soil's temperament. Their tires pressed too deep, churning wet ground into useless muck. They thought force could tame the land. They didn't know patience, didn't know timing, didn't know the quiet conversations with earth that only years can teach. And yet, legally, it was theirs. I turned away, boots heavy on the gravel path. Inside the house, I opened drawers and boxes, pulled out records, receipts, maps, my father's will, signed in bold hand. Tax slips with my name steady at the bottom. Boundary maps I had drawn myself, every line exact, every measurement precise. The paper they had wielded like a weapon might have erased my name once, but here, in my hands, was evidence carved in ink and time. Still, the sting lingered, not from losing the land on paper, but from being cast aside by my own blood. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, lamp burning low, ledger open in front of me. The rain tapped lightly on the window, a steady rhythm against the glass. My reflection looked back at me in the dark pane, older, worn, but unbroken. I thought of all the years I had stood for them, the loans I signed to keep their roof from collapsing, the nights I worked fields so they could sleep, the sacrifices that had kept them afloat, all erased in the span of a few signatures. Anger would have been easy. Rage would have burned hot and fast. But rage solves nothing. Rage leaves ashes. No, I told myself, patience. They had stolen with lies, but lies rot quickly under scrutiny. I would wait. I would gather. I would move not with fury, but with certainty. The betrayal cut deep, yes, but in that wound I felt something else growing. A new kind of strength, the kind that doesn't shout, the kind that doesn't show its hand until the last card is laid down, the kind that ends a game before the other players realize it's over. I closed the ledger, the sound sharp in the quiet room, the lamp flickered, shadows stretching long across the walls. Outside, I heard the low rumble of thunder rolling across the fields. A storm was coming, and this time it would not pass them by. The courthouse file lay on my table for days, untouched, not because I feared it, but because I wanted to study it with a calm mind. Impulse is a young man's game. Precision belongs to age. On the fourth morning, with coffee cooling beside me, I opened it again. Every page whispered arrogance. My nephews had been sloppy. In their hurry to erase me, they left trails of ink that even a blind man could follow. Dates mismatched, signatures wavered, declarations made without witnesses. Paper may bend to ambition, but law bends to detail. I knew details. Details had been my livelihood. As a land surveyor, my life had been ink on maps, lines across fields, the patient certainty that every inch had to be exact. A fence post in the wrong place could ignite feuds lasting generations. And I had been the man who knew where truth began and ended. Now, I would use that craft again. I began with the maps. From an old cabinet, I pulled drawers filled with rolled parchment, my handwriting curling across each corner, boundaries marked with precision, coordinates exact, and at the bottom of each map, in careful ink, Edward Halbrook, certified surveyor. My signature, my seal. The land had not moved. The lines I drew decades ago were still true. The maps proved more than ownership. They proved continuity, that I had been present, constant, the anchor in a family adrift. Next came the receipts. I dug through ledgers so old the pages threatened to crumble in my hands. Tax slips folded and filed, each bearing the same name, mine. Payment after payment, year after year. When my nephews were still boys chasing fireflies, I was writing checks that kept the land from being swallowed by the state. Then the will, my father's hand, firm despite his years, declaring without hesitation that the land would remain under my care. He had written it in plain language. The farm stays with Edward, for he is the one who holds it together. I set it all on the table, spread wide like a general's battle plan. Maps, receipts, wills, every piece, a soldier waiting for my command. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, a reminder of patience. This wasn't about rushing to court tomorrow. This was about building a fortress so solid no storm could touch it. I started walking to the county office in small steps, not with noise, not with confrontation, but with quiet inquiries. A question here, a request there. I asked to see old ledgers, pulled dusty files from forgotten cabinets. The clerks barely noticed me. To them, I was just an old man leafing through the past, but in truth, I was gathering weapons. One evening, after the office closed, I sat on my porch with papers stacked beside me. The air was cool, filled with the smell of fresh-cut grass. Crickets sang steady in the fields. I studied each document under the yellow glow of a lamp, marking small notes in the margins. Every inconsistency was another crack in their wall. Every slip of arrogance was another foothold for me to climb. They thought I would storm the gates. Instead, I was digging tunnels beneath their feet. The land itself seemed to approve. Each morning when I walked its ridges, the soil pressed firm beneath my boots. The air carried the scent of harvest past. It had always been patient. It had always outlasted greed, and I was learning from it. I knew one truth better than most. Land waits. And so would I. The countermove had begun, not with fire, but with silence. Not with fury, but with certainty. I leaned back in my chair, closed the ledger, and let the night settle around me. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called low and steady, like a signal. The hunt had begun. I began to notice the way people looked at me in town. Not pity anymore. Curiosity. The kind that comes when whispers run faster than truth. I gave them no answers. Just nods, a steady gaze, and the same calm silence I'd carried my whole life. Let them wonder. Let my nephews hear the questions growing behind their backs. Doubt is a seed. Once planted, it spreads. At the county office, I asked for certified copies of tax receipts, one by one. Each slip of paper stamped and sealed with dates stretching back decades. The clerk raised an eyebrow at the sheer stack I requested, but he said nothing. He slid them across the counter, and I tucked them neatly into my case. Next, I pulled the will from its drawer, my father's last words in ink. I had it notarized again, reinforcing its chain of custody. The notary looked at me with mild surprise. "Why so sudden, Edward?" she asked. I just smiled faintly. Just keeping records clean. Clean. That word carried more weight than she knew. At home, the table filled again. Papers spread in careful order. Tax slips on the left, maps down the middle, will on the right. Each piece connected, each page confirming the next. The web tightened with every hour I spent cross-referencing. But I didn't stop there. I went further back, into the archives. Land grant records from my grandfather's time. Survey maps filed in thick books no one had touched in half a century. Each document bore the Halbrook name, a thread unbroken. I traced it with my finger like a rosary, steady and reverent. Meanwhile, my nephews paraded around town as new landowners. I heard them boasting at the diner, speaking loud enough for the whole room. "He's too old to keep up," one said, fork stabbing at his plate. "We'll run the place better than he ever did," the other added, laughter following like a trail of smoke. I sat in the corner booth, sipping coffee, unseen by choice. I let their words float past me, hollow and brittle. If only they knew that every boast they made was building the stage for their own downfall. Because I had already begun filing quiet petitions, requests for verification, challenges to signatures. Each motion lodged quietly, like stones placed in a river. Alone they were nothing, but together they would redirect the current entirely. No one noticed the old man with his papers. No one saw the storm gathering in silence. One evening, as I walked the fence line under a sky streaked with fading light, I paused at the crooked oak tree again. My father's tree. I pressed my hand to its bark, rough and cool beneath my palm. "You knew this would happen, didn't you?" I whispered. "That one day they'd forget." The wind stirred, rustling leaves above me, and for a moment it felt like an answer. I stayed there until the stars came out, my breath steady in the night air. My resolve sharpened with every passing hour. The countermove was nearly complete. I wasn't just reclaiming land. I was reclaiming dignity, the truth they had tried to bury under signatures and smirks. And when the moment came, when the court called my name, I would not need to raise my voice. The papers would speak louder than their laughter ever did. The first sign of their undoing came quietly. It always does. A letter arrived at their door from the bank. I didn't need to see it to know what it said. Word travels fast in a small town. They had leveraged the land as collateral for loans, counting on its paper value to secure their big plans. Tractors, equipment, a shiny new pickup. They mistook possession for permanence. But banks are not sentimental, and banks do not look kindly on forged deeds. I watched from my porch as one of my nephews argued with the man in the crisp suit who came calling, his face red, his hands flailing, voice sharp with panic. The banker didn't flinch. He just stood there, pointing to the paper in his hand. From a distance, I couldn't hear the words, but I didn't need to. I knew the rhythm of financial ruin. I'd seen it in neighbors who borrowed too deep, who thought land was a bottomless well rather than a reservoir that demands care. My nephews had thought the same. Meanwhile, whispers grew in town. "Did you hear the Halbrook boys might lose the farm?" Something about the papers not being right. I thought old Ed was done for. Maybe not. Each whisper was a stone in their pockets, dragging them lower. I kept to my routines, calm as ever, coffee at the diner, a nod to the clerk at the office, a slow walk along the ridge at dusk, let them see me steady, let them measure my silence against their flailing. One afternoon, I walked into the feed store. The owner, a man who'd known me 50 years, leaned close and said, "Your nephews are asking for credit." I turned them away. Didn't feel right. I just nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of my mouth. Silence was my answer. At night, I lit the lamp at my kitchen table and read through the documents again. Every slip of ink they had left behind now worked against them. Every oversight became another nail in their coffin. My petitions had been filed, the court date set, the net was closing. But I did not rush it. No rushing would have spoiled the lesson. I wanted them to feel the ground shift under their feet. I wanted them to know what it was to be powerless, to watch something they thought was theirs slip slowly, surely, beyond their grasp. One evening, as I walked the northern fence line, I saw them again. My nephews, standing in the yard, voices raised, faces tight with frustration. Papers waved in the air between them, arguments spilling louder than the cicadas buzzing in the trees. I leaned against the fence post, the wood rough under my palm, and simply watched. They didn't see me. They were too caught in their own unraveling. It struck me then how quickly arrogance crumbles. Months ago, they had laughed over coffee, signing my name away. Now they shouted at each other, their voices cracking, their future slipping through their hands. The land, quiet and patient, waited, and so did I. Because downfall isn't a single strike, it's the slow collapse of a house built on lies. And I had built the storm that would finish it. I turned back toward the house, the evening air cool against my face. Behind me, their voices still echoed, sharp and desperate. Ahead of me, my porch light glowed steady, a beacon against the dark. The cracks were showing, the walls were giving way. And soon, silence would do what anger never could, bring them to their knees. The courtroom smelled faintly of dust and polished oak. Sunlight slanted through high windows, cutting sharp lines across the benches. I sat quietly at the front, my hat in my lap, papers stacked neatly beside me. My nephews shuffled in, their shoulders stiff, eyes darting. The swagger they once carried had drained away, replaced by the nervous twitch of men who know the ground beneath them is cracking. The judge entered, robes brushing the floor. His gavel struck once, a sound that silenced even the whispers at the back of the room. Halbrook versus Halbrook, he announced. The irony of blood fighting blood hung thick in the air. My nephew's lawyer stood first, speaking fast, voice oily with confidence that sounded thinner the longer it went on. He painted me as frail, forgetful, incapable. He said I had signed away my rights willingly. He said I was too weak to fight, that I had no claim left. I listened, expression steady, eyes fixed not on him but on the papers before me. His words slid off me like rain on stone, because words fade, paper remains. When it was my turn, I did not rise with haste. I stood slowly, each movement deliberate, letting the weight of my age become the strength they had mistaken for weakness. My voice was low, calm, measured. I handed the judge the first stacked tax receipts spanning decades, each one bearing my name. This land, I said, has been paid for by these hands, year after year, without fail. Next, I laid down the maps, my seal pressed into each corner. Lines drawn with the precision of a man who had walked every inch. This land was surveyed by me, boundaries set, records kept. Not once did I abandon it. Finally, the will. My father's words, bold and clear. The farm stays with Edward. I did not need to raise my voice. The documents spoke louder than any accusation. The judge read in silence, the only sound the shuffle of pages. My nephews shifted in their seats, whispers rising between them, panic etched into their faces. Their lawyer tried to object, but the judge's hand silenced him with a single gesture. At last the gavel struck again. This court finds the deeds in question to be invalid. Ownership of the land reverts fully and solely to Edward Halbrook. The words echoed through the chamber, final as stone. I stood still, hands resting on the back of the bench before me. My nephews sagged in their seats, their bravado gone, their future shattered in the quiet authority of the ruling. There was no triumph on my face, only certainty. I gathered my papers, tucked them carefully into my case, and walked out. The wooden doors groaned open, sunlight spilling across me as I stepped into the square. Behind me, the murmurs of the courtroom rose, a tide of judgment not aimed at me, but at those who had tried to steal with ink and arrogance. Outside, the air smelled of cut grass and distant rain. I drew a slow breath, steady and deep. The land was mine again, not because I fought with fists or fury, but because I had trusted patience and truth to outlast lies. Their downfall was complete, and I had spoken only when it mattered most. The land felt different under my boots the morning after the ruling. Not because it had changed, but because it had been restored. The fields stretched out the same as they always had, ridges rolling, fences standing, the oak tree crooked against the sky. But now each step carried a weight lifted. I walked the northern boundary at dawn. Mist curled low across the soil, soft and silver, blurring the edges of the world. Birds stirred in the hedgerows, their calls sharp in the still air. I paused, breathing deep, filling my chest with the damp scent of earth. For the first time in years, I felt the land breathe back. At the fence line, I rested my hand on a post worn smooth by decades. My father's voice came back, steady, as if he were standing beside me. Land is patient, Edward. It waits for the man who waits with it. He had been right. I had waited, and the land had waited with me. In town, the reaction was quieter but just as telling. Heads nodded when I passed. A few men tipped their hats. The whispers that once carried pity now carried respect. They didn't need to speak it aloud. I saw it in their eyes, the recognition that silence had proven stronger than bluster. As for my nephews, they walked the streets with shoulders hunched, their laughter gone. No one looked at them with admiration anymore. The same neighbors they'd boasted to now turned away. Pride turned to pity, and pity turned to shame. They had thought they'd written me out of history. Instead, they had written themselves into disgrace. I never gloated. Not once. Revenge, when true, doesn't need a parade. It lives in the quiet knowledge that justice stood steady, unshaken by lies. At the diner, I sat in my usual booth, coffee steaming before me. The waitress poured without a word, but the smile she gave me was different this time, not pity, not politeness, but respect. Across the room, my nephews sat together, shoulders drawn, their plates half finished. They glanced at me once, quickly, then dropped their eyes. I let the silence sit between us, heavier than any words. They had mocked me for being weak, for being too old, for being silent. And now that silence was the loudest sound in the room. Back home, I stood again by the oak tree, its branches spread wide like arms holding the sky. I thought of the generations who had walked this land before me. My grandfather's sweat, my father's labor, my own years poured into the soil. That chain had nearly been broken. Nearly. But nearly is not the same as done. I touched the bark, rough beneath my palm, and whispered, "It's ours again." The wind stirred in answer. I turned back toward the house, each step measured, steady. The farm was quiet. The land was mine. The silence was enough. Because silence, when it holds truth, is never weakness. It is victory. Evenings on the farm became my sanctuary again. The sun slipped low over the fields, painting them gold before sinking behind the ridge. I would sit on the porch, hat resting on my knee, listening to the crickets rise in chorus as the sky darkened. This was how life was meant to be lived. Steady, unhurried, free of pretense. The land breathed in rhythm with me, and I with it. I did not gloat. I did not need to. My nephews had already punished themselves far better than I ever could. The shame clung to them heavier than any debt. They passed me on the road sometimes, their eyes darting away, their shoulders stooped. I never spoke. A nod was enough. Silence carried more weight than confrontation ever could. Neighbors began to visit more often. They would linger at the porch rail, hats in hand, talking about weather and harvests, but their eyes always drifted to me with quiet respect. They saw not just the man who had reclaimed his land, but the lesson beneath it, that patience, truth, and silence can outlast arrogance. One evening, an old friend sat beside me as the fireflies lit the yard. He sipped his coffee slow, then said, "Ed, they thought you were finished." I chuckled softly, the sound low and steady. They mistook silence for surrender. He nodded, and we didn't need to say more. As night settled, I walked once more to the crooked oak tree. Its branches stretched wide, leaves whispering in the breeze. I laid my hand against the bark, feeling its roughness under my palm, the steady pulse of life still running through it. This tree had grown with me. It had weathered storms, just as I had. It had bent, but it had never broken, and neither had I. Looking out across the fields, I felt no bitterness, only clarity. Revenge wasn't fire and fury. It was the quiet endurance that outlasted lies. It was the patience that waited for the truth to rise, as surely as the sun does after night. The land was mine again. But more than that, my dignity was whole. I turned back toward the house, lantern glowing faintly in the window. The path was familiar under my feet, gravel crunching soft, the air cool against my face. Tomorrow would be another day. The land would need tending, as it always had. And I would tend it not because of what I had won, but because of who I had always been. A man who kept faith with the soil. A man who endured. A man who never needed to shout, because silence spoke louder. And so I lived as I always had. Steady, patient, unbroken. Because silence, when it carries truth, is not weakness. It is power.